emotional self-control is the ability to have an emotion, but to limit the extent to which it colors our thinking or drives what we do. Young kids are not very good at this, which is why they have temper tantrums and they have meltdowns and whatever, but that's okay because adults are around them to provide that for them. I know you're mad, don't hit your brother, calm down, let's come over here, let's walk around a little bit, what if you play this instead? So adults provide some of this. As we become an adult ourselves, we're expected to be able to do more of that for ourselves, so to not show our emotions quite as strongly. Folks with ADHD are more likely to express their emotions more strongly. And the reason why they express them outward is that they feel them more inward. So any of us, anytime you feel an emotion strongly on the inside, you're more likely to show it on the outside. So that's normal, that's everybody. But because adults with ADHD tend to feel it more strongly, it tends to come out more. When it's a positive emotion like happiness, excitement, enthusiasm, that's great, and that makes you fun to be around. But when it's something like anger and irritation and frustration, and you show a lot of that, that's where you begin to get into trouble in terms of relationships. Also, the more strongly we feel an emotion, the less likely we are to be able to see the big picture of what's going on. So we may say something that afterwards we regret, or do something that afterwards we regret. Or we lose another person's perspective. So someone does something, we're really angry about it, and we forget the fact that, you know, my boss just said that, but you know what I know? I know that his wife is really sick and he's having a hard time at things, and his boss is giving him a hard time. So you know what? I'm not taking it personally. This isn't about me. He's having a hard time. Let it go by. Whereas someone with ADHD is more likely to react to the boss being kind of a jerk and then throw it back to them in a way that probably doesn't work out well for either person.
Would that have implications for the ability to empathize?
It can, in the heat of the moment. Now, afterwards, when they calm down, like any of us, when we calm down, okay, now I can understand what you're saying. So yeah, definitely. And of course, one of the implications here, especially in terms of couples and relationships, is don't have conversations in the heat of the moment. Somebody needs to say, time out, stop, you go there, I'll go here, we'll be back in 2 minutes. No, not overall. But certainly when someone is emotionally worked up, everybody's less likely to be empathetic. Also, if empathy also requires the ability to put your attention onto someone beyond the obvious parts of the situation, to read some of the subtle body language, and to be able to understand, you know, you're saying, okay, that's fine, we can go where you want to go for dinner, but I can tell you're saying it's okay, but it's not okay. And then we go anyway because I missed that, and then you're mad at me. You should have known, I was just being polite, and you were supposed to be polite and say, okay, fine, let's find somewhere else. You know, so it's one of those situations. But in terms of the basic skill of empathy, ADHD has nothing to do with that. That would be a different thing. Yeah?
Since we talked about empathy, what about emotional intelligence? That you need skills to understand and socially and the other people. What about people with ADD?
To the extent that they're more emotionally volatile, and some people are more like this and some people with ADHD are more like this, some people with ADHD are less like this. You know, these are all kind of, they vary by degree. So someone who is very emotionally reactive probably will have lower emotional intelligence. Or at least during the times that they're emotionally activated, they'll be less able to apply their emotional intelligence. But you know, a lot of adults with ADHD, or I shouldn't say a lot, salespeople tend to have a higher percentage of adults with ADHD compared to other careers. To be a good salesman requires a certain amount of emotional intelligence. You have to read your client or your potential customer. What's going on? What are you saying? Okay, you don't seem interested in what I'm saying. Let me angle it a little different. Or let me look at you. Okay, I think I know the way to take with you. So in that case, that's excellent emotional intelligence, to be able to read a client well.
So people with ADD are not good as salesmen.
No, they are good at
Yeah,
salesmen. Yeah, some of them are. Yeah, very much. But it's like anything. I mean, ADHD is only a part of what someone is, and they have other strengths, they have other experiences, they have other skills. So how successful someone is at anything depends on a lot of different factors, not just their ADHD.
I just want to add an observation that I've made that has to do with how the emotional outbursts, probably because of the way things get structured during childhood or because of the poor executive functions, but there's this sense that an ADDer has that they're always, somebody's on their case, or that they're being pressured to do things. So there's that quickness to react to that too. And, you know, that in a couple gets played out in the ADDer reacting really strongly to that. And the non-ADDer feeling having demands.
And that's absolutely right. That, you know, this here is talking about neurology. What you're talking about is psychology, and they're both important. That if your life experience tells you people tend to be on your case often, you're probably going to be more defensive, because why wouldn't you be, you know? So some of that emotional reactivity is not just about neurology, it's also about psychology. That's the bad news, but again, the good news is that gives us 2 points of intervention. That if part of what we can do in therapy and otherwise is help the person to address, you know, kind of address the psychology side of it, then they'll maybe less reactive in the moment, but also then better able to fix it a few moments later or to change the course of things a few moments later. Because it's not just what happens in that one moment, it's about what happens in the moments that follow that determines whether this works out pretty good or not so good.
So within the context of neurology, if someone has poor executive functions and response inhibition issues, you would have to know of emotional dysregulation along with everything else. But that's not what we hear about for ADHD, and it certainly doesn't make you think, oh, emotional dysregulation, ADHD. So
well, and you're absolutely right that we don't hear about it, but we should. And, you know, back in DSM-2, which was, you know, forever ago, this emotional part was actually in DSM-2. For ADHD, for some reason it came out of DSM-3. I don't know why, but it got, I think maybe because psychiatry was moving towards more observable things. And emotions are not, they're squishier, they're slipperier, you know, as opposed to this more behavioral, observable kind of stuff. That's probably why the emotional piece got dropped. But there's more attention being put now to this emotional piece. It's a big part of ADHD and it's important. So we are beginning to talk about it more now. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So the next executive function here is the ability of self-activation. So the ability to get ourselves up and moving on something. Doing things that are fun doesn't take any effort. That's like riding a bike downhill. The challenge is to get ourselves moving on something that isn't very fun, but that needs to be done, and hopefully not just at the last minute. So I sort of had this idea, I talk about internal pressure, external pressure. External pressure is somebody saying, you need to do this. Or external pressure is a deadline, this is due tomorrow, I should really get going on it. That's pressure that comes from outside. Self-activation is much more about internal pressure. This isn't due for a few days, but you know, I should probably get going on it because you never know, something else might come up. It's really better if I just have this done. Because folks with ADHD have a harder time making themselves get up and moving on the stuff that's not very interesting, they tend to be more dependent then on external pressure. Somebody else nagging them or pushing them or saying, come on honey, let's get going on this. or on the deadline of the last minute. So they procrastinate, because procrastination is a way to create pressure. You can't create internal pressure, procrastination creates external pressure. But then of course, and then, you know, build on what Niobe said, if when you do things, it tends to not work out well, and if you scramble at the last minute, it's a horrible experience, and it's stressful, and someone's yelling at you, and you know, it's this awful race to the finish line, why would you want to repeat that? So it becomes a situation of like, I don't even want to deal with it, it's so horrible, I'm just going to wait to the very last minute until I have to do it. So it just makes it bigger and bigger and bigger. Hindsight and forethought. So hindsight, if we want to use a more informal term, hindsight is wisdom. It's a wisdom gained from experience. When I did this, this is what happened. When I did that, that's what happened. So we learn from experience and we apply that forward. Forethought is the ability to think through what might happen before you actually do it. So every time you plan a driving route, you know, this way's quicker, the highway's faster, but there's going to be more traffic. The local roads are slower because there's more lights and stuff, and maybe there's less traffic, or I think there's construction on the highway. So thinking through, you don't need to drive both roads at that moment to figure out what the best thing to do is. So these are both important skills, and it's that ability to use both of them that in looking at the past, looking at the future, that informs our decisions in the present. So we make the very best decisions in the moment, moment by moment by moment. People with ADHD can do this when they do it. So if you were to ask them, here's the situation, blah, 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 tell me the right thing to do. They can probably tell you. They can create a good plan. The problem is, in the moment as they're doing it, they don't pause necessarily to stop and think and say, okay, what do I need to do? What are my best options? How do I do this? So this is a little bit of a silly situation, but I have a friend of mine who's a psychologist who also presents on ADHD, and he has ADHD. And we were talking about packing, because we always see each other at the big ADHD conference. So to help himself pack, like his packing list, he draws a stick figure as a reminder. So he starts at the top and says, what do I need for my head? Okay, I need shampoo, I need a brush, I need this. You look at for my body, okay, I need a jacket, I need shirts, I need an undershirt. For my legs, what do I need for my legs? What do I need for my feet? And literally, like that's, and what he's doing is this. This stick figure, as silly as it is, helps him stop and think about every part of what he needs to do. As opposed to just saying, well, what do I need? And you throw a bunch of stuff together, and then you realize you don't have any pants and you forgot a belt. Or you have all your clothes except you don't have any socks or something, because it's like, you don't stop to think about it. So the good news for kids and teens with ADHD is that our brains continue to develop through our mid to late 20s. That's the good news. It's kind of interesting, for most of us, when do we tend to finish our education? By our mid to late 20s. It's kind of a coincidence, but maybe it's not a coincidence. So people with ADHD, younger people with ADHD, their executive functions are a little bit behind in terms of the development other kids are that same age. So a 10-year-old versus 10-year-olds, a 15-year-old versus 15-year-olds. Some of that will catch up into their 20s. But at the end, it may not catch up as much as, you know, a 30-year-old compared to other 30-year-olds. So instead, if it's not happening inside their head, then we look for strategies and treatments and things outside of their head. So things like medication, or something called cognitive working memory training, and I'll talk very briefly about that. Compensatory strategies, tools like setting alarms on your cell phone or using a to-do list on your phone. And then in terms of therapy, reducing the psychological fallout, and then the feedback loop. I hate doing this stuff, it doesn't work out well, don't put in a whole lot of effort, and then it doesn't work out well. Around and around we go. So I have a couple free, I've got my 3 books, but I've got some free chapters from two of the books. So the first chapter of my book, More Attention, Less Deficit, is all about executive function. So it tells a little in more detail some of this stuff. That's available on my website, which is adultadhdbook.com. So feel free to take a look. Feel free to recommend it to clients. Do with it what you will. I also have a free PDF of the working memory chapter from the new workbook called Understand Your Brain, Get More Done. So that information is there. Feel free to use it if it's helpful. So that lays the foundation for understanding ADHD. Now we get into the treatment. But you need to lay the foundation to understand it before you know what to do about it. So, as I said in the beginning, there are 4 parts to the treatment model. And I talk about this kind of extensively in the green book, the Integrative Treatment for Adult ADHD book. So education is involved with, or the goal of education is to reduce guilt, primarily unproductive guilt, to help the person with ADHD understand their life a little bit better. You know, why did certain things work out in my past, but also what are strategies I can use going forward. And regardless of what kind of psychoanalytic therapy you might be doing, there's a lot to be gained by offering good resources on ADHD. Whether it's for an adult, for the romantic partner of an adult, or for the parents of a kid. Knowledge is definitely power. Medication improves response inhibition, so it helps the executive functions work better in the symptoms and thereby reduces the symptoms. Coaching, which in my case, when I talk about coaching, what I mean is specific strategies and habits to help someone with ADHD be more consistent and be more effective. And then finally, therapy to address how living with ADHD, whether it's been for your 8 years or for your 50 years, how ADHD has affected your sense of yourself, your sense of effectiveness in the world, and then any secondary anxiety or depression that may have come out of ADHD, or is unrelated, but you know, if you're anxious or depressed or whatever, you're not going to do as well in terms of applying your abilities and enjoying life. Ultimately, the goal of treatment is all about improved consistency. However you approach treatment, whatever it is that you do, whatever a client does, it's all about improved consistency. So fewer times where their executive functions kind of glitch on them, where they don't do the thing that hopefully they would, or just making the consequences less severe. So for example, you know, having a one of the things I often suggest to clients is setting certain bills on automatic pay. So like the electric bill, setting it up so that the electric company automatically pulls the money out of your bank account, or it goes to a credit card or something else. You don't have to write a check and mail it. If it happens automatically, you cannot forget it. Or other things like that to make it just an easier kind of a thing. My basic treatment approach, especially for clients with ADHD, but really for anybody, and even how I think about my own life, is this idea of change what you can, accept the rest. And it's not like this is my idea. This is a pretty universal idea, but that really both are important. So change what you can in this case means either through medication or strategies, help the person actually do better in life, because that's important. Having said that, nobody's going to be perfect. We all have things we're not going to do well at. We all have things about ourselves we wish were different. And if you stay stuck on that, you're not going to be happy. You're not going to feel good about the progress that you do make. So part of happiness also required finding a way to be okay with the parts of yourself that are still different than what you would wish them to be. So it's that balancing act, and it's hard to know exactly where that line is sometimes. But hopefully you figure it out. You try what you can, and then you accept the things that don't change. I have this concept that I call the magic threshold. And the idea is this, that you don't have to be perfect in order to be happy, or to have other people be happy with you. That sometimes just making partial progress creates a much better situation. So, for example, in a couple where one person has ADHD and she tends to run late, So just to make up a number, you know, she's 20 minutes late like twice a week in meeting her boyfriend. He's not happy about it, she's not happy about it, but that's the way it's working out. So if the idea is she needs to never ever be late again, that's not going to happen. No, first of all, nobody's that good. So that's a setup for trouble. And if I was in her shoes and the expectation was you will never be late again, I would say like, well, okay, well forget it then. Why bother? I'm never going to get that, so forget it. I'm not, like, I give up. Instead, you know, the idea here of the magic threshold is maybe never ever late is impossible. So maybe according to her boyfriend, instead of being 20 minutes late twice a week, maybe she's 10 minutes late, you know, sort of once a week. Or maybe once, but sometimes twice a week. But, you know, it's better. Maybe he can live with 10 minutes. He's not thrilled about it. He would prefer that she was early rather than 10 minutes late. But you know what? Okay, I can play on my phone for 10 minutes. Fine. So she's less late less often. That feels doable. Now she'll work for it. The flip side of this also is he is less angry less often. So it's not just her, it's also him, because relationships have two people. And even if one person is being more obvious about what they bring, the other person is reacting to it. And they have a lot of possible ways to, there's many ways to react to somebody being late. Being angry is only one of them. And it's not just a matter of, I'm going to not be angry at you because it isn't fun for you when I'm angry. It's not fun for me to be angry. You know, so for me to be angry and ruin the first hour of us having dinner, who wins there? Like, is anybody having a good time at that point? So it's really for both people to work on it. And maybe he's still a little bit mad, but he's not really mad. So it takes him 5 minutes, and then he's kind of like, okay, you know what, I'm all right. So the idea of the magic threshold, or of kind of changing some of the expectations, actually makes success feel more doable, and people are more willing to work hard for an expectation that feels doable. Something that's too hard to achieve, people give up and they don't put their best effort. It is now 12:59. We're supposed to stop at 1. This is probably a pretty good place to stop. So let's try to get back by 1. So at 1 o'clock we're really kind of start and off we go. Just no, it is 1. Let's stop at 2. You have more than 1 minute for lunch. So let's try to get back here so we can really get into it, so we don't have to race through the good stuff at the end. So why don't we get going again here then? So we're going to begin here in the afternoon by talking about education. And by education, what I mean is teaching clients, adults, parents, kids, teens about ADHD. That the better they understand their ADHD and how it affects their life, the better position they're in to use some better strategies or to feel better about themselves and what happens around them. So, you know, for everybody, the better you know yourself, the more likely you are to be successful. That's true for everybody. So understanding one's ADHD is an important part of that, because it's not just about, because in other words, some people, for example, they get the idea, you know, I was never good at school, so I'm not going to go to graduate school and get more training because it's not going to work out well. If that's not an accurate statement, or at least it's not completely accurate, then when you take their ADHD into account and you address it a little differently, maybe now graduate school really is a viable option for them. So in that case, that would be an inaccurate way of looking at themselves. So helping them understand the effect of ADHD. And some of that is we just give them things, as in, here's a good website, here's a video, here's a good book. But it's also a matter of talking to them about it in our sessions and making those connections between what's happened either in their past or just, you know, yesterday, and what it is that they do going forward. So, you know, so education really works, I think of it as working at 2 levels. There's the emotional side of it, and you know, there's a book that it was one of the original books about adult ADHD. The title is excellent. It's just pure genius. I don't like how the rest of the book is written, but the title I think is phenomenal. And the title is, "You Mean I'm Not Lazy, Stupid, or Crazy?" And what's great about it is, if you have ADHD, but ADHD is not a possible explanation for you, the things that you're left with is you're too lazy to do what you're supposed to. You're crazy because you keep shooting yourself in the foot and getting yourself into trouble. Or you're just stupid and you're just not that smart, and that's why you keep making all these mistakes. It's really hard to feel good about any of those things, as opposed to seeing it as, you know, my brain works a little bit differently in terms of these specific things, but otherwise I can be pretty intelligent, I mean well, I'm a good person, and I can be successful. That's a whole different way of looking at it. So taking it not as this big character statement of, you know, this is who I am, you know, lazy, stupid, or crazy, but just this is a part of who I am, and I just need to approach some things a little differently so I can bring forth the rest of my good abilities. That's a much better way of looking at it. But the pragmatic side is important as well, that if you know you have ADHD, it just means that certain strategies are going to work better for you. With that knowledge comes responsibility, that if you know this strategy works well, you need to do it. You need to use this strategy. You can't say, well, I have ADHD, so what are you going to do? That there's a responsibility to apply that. So as therapists or as clinicians, we share our knowledge of ADHD a couple different ways. Sometimes we do it indirectly, in the sense of we don't say, well, because you have ADHD, therefore, blah, 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 blah. We just say the blah, 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 but it's the right blah, blah, blah. You know, so in other words, we don't, if someone, you know, is kind of, their room is disorganized and their wife is unhappy about it, we don't go down the road of, I wonder if there's passive-aggressive tendencies at work here, let's explore that. Maybe we do, but you don't start there. You start with, maybe this is ADHD related, let's take a look at that. You may wind up that it actually, there also are some passive-aggressive tendencies towards his wife, but that's not the only thing that you look at. But even, so that's indirectly, but even directly, there are times where I say, well, you know, because you have ADHD, blah, 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 and I say, you know, I don't say the blah, 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 but I say the because you have ADHD, or I'll say, you know, a lot of people with ADHD have trouble with, you know, whatever it is that we're talking about. So therefore, and then you present a strategy, another way of doing it, another way of looking at it. Whether it's about something that happened long ago, you know, 20 years ago when you were in high school, or it's something that happened yesterday, or something talking about, you know, here's the thing you need to do next week, maybe here's some ideas for how to approach it. Usually by the time someone winds up in our offices, their family members are tired. If they weren't tired, they wouldn't come looking for you. You know, so by definition, we get the people when they're tired. So it's important to educate the family members as well. And it's not simply to say, well, you know, your child or spouse or whatever, they have ADHD, so, oh, well, this is what your life will look like. You know, it's not that. But it's saying this is a part of who they are. This is a part of what you guys, as a couple, as a family, are going to need to deal with. Just like every family has things that they deal with. It's just in the case of ADHD, it's this stuff, as opposed to in the case of something else, it's other stuff. Or, you know, my wife has to deal with the fact that because I see kids and teens, I don't leave the office at 5. If I leave the office at 5, I can see 2 clients a week, or I can see 2 kids or teens a week, because 3 o'clock is the earliest they can show up. So I work until 9, and that sucks in a lot of ways, and that's something we have to deal with. But we deal with it. And people who have a long commute to work, they deal with it. People who have arthritis, they deal with it. We deal with things in life. That's what life is, dealing with things. So I think it's important to frame ADHD as a part of that and not as sort of a curse or a burden upon the family or upon the non-ADHD partners, that they're sort of the victims here. So often when someone comes in, whether it's a spouse or a parent, they have certain expectations. You know, I should just be able to tell him to do his homework and he should do it. Or if I ask her to pick something up on the way home from work, I should be able to expect her to do it without me having to remind her. And on the one hand, I agree. I say, well, yeah, I mean, that does sound pretty reasonable. And I agree that that's frustrating that it doesn't work out that way. But here's the thing. It isn't working out. Doing what you're doing, it's not working. If it was working, you wouldn't come to see me. So it's a good goal that this thing, whatever it is, maybe gets done. But perhaps if you approach it in a different way, then maybe it's more likely to happen. The goal is a good one. The way you're trying to get there is not the good way. You see that difference? So, and we'll talk more about this in the therapy section when we talk about couples and family dynamics. But sometimes in addition to, I mean, well, first of all, us as the clinician, in other words, the person who's not married to the person, we have a whole lot more credibility. Or like, if your mom tells you something, it's like, well, but then some psychologist tells you or some doctor tells you, it's a whole, now, okay, now I believe you. Or your spouse tells you something, well, maybe it's true, but your spouse has an agenda as well, of course. So, but then someone else says it. Even if you're saying some of the same stuff, just because of who you are, because you're not married to them, you have more credibility in saying it. Doesn't mean that your spouse believes everything you say, but they believe what someone else says, so I suppose it's fair. But also, by giving a book or a website or something, can lend some extra credibility to say it's not just your spouse saying it, it's not just me saying it, look, it's this book also that says it. And maybe then they can say, okay, I accept that, let's see what we can do here. And the whole acceptance thing is a very important part. But otherwise, let's talk quickly here about medication. Now, we have one prescriber here. Is anyone else a prescriber in the room? Anyone write prescriptions for medication? Even though you don't write prescriptions, it's still important to know about the medications. Partially because, at least for me, I assume that's the same for all the other psychologists and therapists out here, you probably see your clients more often than the prescriber does, which means you're going to get questions more often. And it doesn't mean that you tell your clients what to do with their prescriptions, but you need to know enough to be able to say, that doesn't sound right. You need to call your doctor. Or, sounds like the dose is too low. You need to call your doctor and see about increasing it or decreasing it or something. So, the other thing to keep in mind here is that the choice to take medication, the choice to continue medication, even if you're not prescribing the medication, I think that's still a valid topic for us to talk about. Our goal as therapists is we help our clients make well thought out decisions based on good information. So that's part of what I do. When I talk to clients about medication, that's what I'm doing. Just like when I talk to them about, should they change jobs, or in this relationship, this is going on with their girlfriend. Is this a reasonable thing that she expects? Is this not a reasonable thing? What does it mean to him that she expects it? What can he do in response to that? So talking about medication is, as far as I'm concerned, completely a valid topic to talk about in therapy, because there's a lot of psychology involved in taking medication or in thinking about, for example, does taking medication mean cheating? I'm cheating because the medication does it for me. Does it mean there's something wrong with you because only people with problems take medication? Does it mean you're crazy that you have to take medication? Does it mean you can't do it on your own? Now, I don't think any of these things, but do we have clients who think this stuff? Absolutely. So, we need to talk about medication, because if we don't, they're not going to make good choices about medication. So, what the medication does then is, from the perspective of executive functions, it increases response inhibition. It increases that gap between stimulus and response. So the executive functions can operate and do what they're supposed to do. So it doesn't make choices for them, but it gives them a better opportunity to make those good choices for themselves. So that's what we're looking for medication. With any medication, including aspirin, there are risks and there are side effects. We need to consider that. But we also have to consider what are the risks and side effects of not treating ADHD. And if you remember from the beginning, you know, some of the things that I mentioned in terms of some of the side effects of untreated ADHD, that's pretty important. And a lot of people will come in, especially more parents of kids, and say, no way am I putting my kid on meds. And I understand what they're saying, and I'm not in favor of medicating everyone anyway. But by the same token, I'm also not in favor of kids doing badly in school and hating education. I'm not in favor of adults doing badly at work and maybe losing a job or not getting a promotion, losing a relationship, paying more in late fees because they've lost the bill and they forgot to pay it. I'm not in favor of all that other stuff too. So we need to balance out what is gained from medication versus what are the risks of medication. But I think it's important to remember that, and I used this line the last couple of days, taking medication is not like getting a tattoo. You get a tattoo, you pretty much have a tattoo forever. I mean, I guess you could sort of get it taken off, but trying medication just means you are trying medication. And sometimes you try medication to see what it's going to do. Once you know what it's going to do, now you have a really informed decision about what are the potential benefits, what are the potential side effects, and is it worth it? If it is worth it, you keep taking it. If it's not worth it, then you don't. But you can make that choice day by day. So the best medications for ADHD, whether we're talking about kids or adults, is the stimulants. So it's the same old Ritalin that's been around since the 1950s, is still being used today, including in a form called Concerta, which is plain Ritalin, except the problem with plain Ritalin, it only lasts 3 or 4 hours. Concerta, the way the pill is designed, it lasts 8 to 12 hours. So you take it once a day, not 2 or 3 times a day. For adults, the standard dose range is 36 to 72 milligrams per day. So those are the dosages that Concerta comes in. Generally, the extended release versions are preferred. To remember to take a pill 3 times a day is really hard. If you were to take plain old Ritalin, you might take 10 milligrams 3 times a day, 20 milligrams 3 times a day, to get up to this 36 to 72. So you would split it out differently in terms of the dosing. You wouldn't take 35 milligrams all at once necessarily. The rest of these, unfortunately, are available in the States. They're not available here in Greece, as I understand it. So the Daytrana patch is just Ritalin in a patch form. So you stick it on and then it lasts all day. Adderall XR, or Vyvanse, as I understand it, are not available. I contacted the manufacturer to see, and they're not. Having said that, if you have some clients who go abroad, they might be able to get prescriptions for one of these, so I don't know. But generally speaking, it's the stimulants that really do work the best. For some people, if they take a Concerta, let's say, or another extended release in the morning, it lasts for a period of time, but it doesn't last long enough. And in those cases, you can add in a little bit more of the short-acting Ritalin at the end of the day to push that effect out a little further. So a child who has school, and then sports, and dinner, and then homework at 7 o'clock. They took Concerta at 7 in the morning, there's nothing left by 7 at night when it's time to do homework. Or an adult who has work all day, but then they also, they need to do things at home because dinner needs to be made and kids need to be put to bed and all that other stuff. So that's sometimes a helpful thing to add on a little bit more. Generally speaking, you start at a low dose and you go up about every 3 days to a week, maybe 2 weeks. Then you go up little by little until you reach that point where the person says, okay, there, that's a good dose. Or they say, I went too far, let's go back one. And they say, there, that's the right dose. And the right dose is, it's a little bit subjective in the sense of, you know, just sort of like, okay, yeah, I feel more focused, I feel more sharp, I feel like the chatter in my head is a little quieter. Like I can pay attention to what I'm supposed to pay attention to. It's easier to start something that needs to be done. So in other words, it sounds like a lot of the executive functions, you know, a lot of the executive functions just work a little bit better.
Is there some kind of side effect that you stop
Nope.
just cold drinking?
No. Because if you take it in the morning, by the end of the day, you're pretty much off it anyway. So if you don't take it tomorrow morning, you weren't on it then anyway. So what it means is, some people take it just during the week and they don't take it on weekends. Or kids take it at school during the school year but not in the summer. So you can be flexible about it, which is nice that you have that flexibility. The bad news is if you forget to take it tomorrow, you got nothing. So,
We have low, forgot the word, dopamine, low levels of dopamine. That's why we need stimulus. But for hyperactive people who have high levels of dopamine and they need to anti-stimulus.
actually, it's, so for people who are hyperactive, it's not that they have too much dopamine and that's why they're going. It's that the brakes, you know, like in the car putting on the brakes, the power is there and the brakes aren't strong enough to slow down and hold the impulses and hold the hyperactivity. So it's actually, you need extra dopamine in both cases to either slow down the hyperactivity or to slow down the mental, we could think of it, it's not quite accurate, but mental hyperactivity of thinking about this and thinking about that and getting distracted by that sound and all of that. So, so whether we're talking about inattention or whether we're talking about hyperactivity, impulsivity, same medication works in both cases. But yeah, it doesn't make sense on the surface, because why do you give a stimulant to someone who's already going?
To activate the brakes.
Yeah, yeah. It makes the brakes stronger.
Last question. I have heard, and I want to see if it's true, that in children, these medication, one of the side effects may be that it inhibits their physical growth. Is that true?
It's hard to say if that's true. It's a common thing that, it's a common belief that the stimulants result in some growth suppression. What is definitely true is that stimulants are appetite suppressants. So when you're taking the medication, you're not as hungry during the time that it's working. But, so in other words, you take it in the morning, breakfast is fine, it hasn't kicked in yet, dinner is fine because it's probably worn off, but lunch, maybe you're not so hungry. So appetite suppression, yes. Maybe some weight loss, yes. That's definitely true. The whole growth suppression, it's hard to say really when you look at the research. Maybe there's a small amount, like literally like that, of height suppression. But I have to say, if it's my kid, I would totally give that up. You know, if he's going to be that much shorter, who cares? If it spared him some of the other, like if he needed it, obviously. But even on the weight side of it, often what you see in terms of the weight loss is it looks like this. You start medication, it dips, and then it comes up like that. So,
They have not been so much.
Naomi's taking great delight in her husband getting locked out. So you might see in the first days and weeks, you might see an initial drop in weight of a few pounds or so, but then over time our body naturally rebalances and the weight comes back. So in the long run, our bodies just figure it out again.
And I actually think that we have data regarding dose suppression that they do catch up within 2 years after they stop. So,
Right.
but I also wanted to say, from a clinical perspective, educating someone about medication, because what I get from parents quite often is that they stop the meds, as you said, over the summer, and they come back and they say, well, he did fine without it. But it was the summer.
Yeah. And that's when you say, okay, good. Call me at the end of September.
Right.
And actually, have the teacher call me at the end of September. Let's talk then. So, but, you know, if it's the summer and they don't need medication, fine. Why take it if you don't need it? On the other hand, if someone is very hyperactive and impulsive, and they're constantly getting in fights with siblings, and they're reacting to big reactions to things, and they're making impulsive choices, you know, so a teenager who's making impulsive driving decisions, it's not school, but you might still want them to be on medication at those times.
Do you think there are other ways to medicate, especially for children, and not through chemistry, let's say through nutrition or through vitamins or minerals or some other more physical ways to intervene?
We'll talk about that, because that's a question that comes up a lot. So yeah, definitely we'll talk about it. I think in probably 2 more slides. So
And are you going to talk about stratera too?
I will. I think that's the next slide. So okay, it's one after this. No, it's one after this. But yeah, we will talk about stratera. So in general, in terms of the side effects, the stimulants, we have a pretty good combination of good main effects. So the number of people who get a benefit from them is pretty high. The extent of the benefit tends to be pretty good. And the extent of the risks and side effects tends to be pretty low. That's a good combination. In contrast to some of, let's say, the mood stabilizers, so if someone has bipolar disorder, they tend to be on 2 or 3 meds, ultimately. And a lot of the meds have, you know, dangerous side effects in terms of not just weight gain, but increased risk for diabetes and other sort of things. So we haven't, the bipolar meds are nowhere near as good as the stimulants. So we are pretty lucky in the world of medication when it comes to ADHD. But to the extent that there are side effects, generally they tend to fade out over time. So over a few days or a week or 2 of it, each time you increase the dose, the side effects will tend to go away. So if they're not too bad, the person can hang in, it'll get better with some time. But the side effects that tend to show up most are appetite suppression, as we talked about, feeling jittery, kind of a little too, like you had too much coffee sort of thing. Some insomnia, so trouble falling asleep. Although some people with ADHD have trouble falling asleep anyway, before medication, so you need to consider that too. But that one's a pretty easy one to fix. Either you lower the dose or you take it earlier in the day. If you have too much in your system at bedtime, that's when you're going to have trouble falling asleep. So you either move the whole dose earlier or you shrink the dose, if that makes sense.
Excuse me. The dose is with the weight of the client, isn't it? How you can increase the dose?
So the question is dose is set by the weight of the client. It's loosely set in the sense that people who are bigger, by which I mean people who weigh more, tend to take a bigger dose than people who weigh less. But that's a loose thing. I have little kids taking 54 and 72 milligrams of Concerta, and I have 250 pound, you know, so 100 kilo guys taking 36 milligrams of Concerta. So it's not one of those things where you take your weight and then we calculate out and say that's the one. So you start at the bottom and you just go up until you find the right dose. And it isn't even necessarily a thing that the worse someone's ADHD is, the higher the dose, because it's a matter of how efficient is your body at taking up the medication and then using it where it needs to be used. So, but you know, if let's say someone's on 54 milligrams of Concerta, it's working pretty well, but the side effects are just too bad and they don't like it, they just drop down to 36 in that case. And then hopefully they still get most of what they want on the good side.
You have to stop gradually, or you can stop and start, no problem.
Yep.
If the side effect you have is over-focusing on things, you know, especially on feelings, you know, that it gets even worse, but you need the mental focus. So, could you say that you've seen from your clients that you can compensate with strategies, or because maybe the changing the dosage doesn't work because you lose like the effect medication has on your focus. So
And sometimes
You have to
that's-
suffer, you're either gonna suffer from one or the other, but have you had experience with clients that, you've worked on developing strategies or whatever, and that kind of makes the effect milder?
There are times when too much medication gives too much focus, like too much focus, so too rigid in the focus. And that's not a good thing, that's a bad thing, like we talked about with attention regulation. So some of what you do then, if you drop back the dose a little bit, then maybe you still get the good part of the focus, but not the over focus. Some people though, they can't find that happy ground in the middle. So in those cases, sometimes then you just settle for a low dose that does maybe a little bit of something, even if it's not perfect, and then you use other strategies to supplement it. But whether you take medication or not, you're still going to want to do these other strategies. But the thing about the medication is it's like wearing glasses, that you put on your glasses or your contacts and now you can see everything. So now you know where everything is. If you take your glasses off, you still know where everything is, but nobody better move anything. So the strategies you learn that are helpful on medication don't necessarily carry forward when you're off medication, unfortunately. I wish it was one of those things, you take it for a week, let's teach you everything, and then you're done. But we'll talk about a couple other things. So, but a couple other side effects: headache or stomach ache, usually in the first hour. Often that's because you're taking it on an empty stomach. That's the best side effect to have because you can fix it by taking it with food. Or, as the last one is, you kind of suggested, feeling flat or feeling over-focused, like they're too much like this, and they kind of lose the sparkle of their personality. So, stimulants are not addictive. You can choose to abuse them if you would like to, but if you take them as you're supposed to, you're not going to become addicted to them. You're not more likely to become addicted to other drugs. You're actually, if anything, less likely to become addicted to other drugs if you take medication appropriately. There are 4 situations where you don't want to take medication, where you don't want to take a stimulant. So one of them is if you have a history of seizures, at least if it's not well controlled. If medication has kept your seizures away for a year or 2, you can try at that point a stimulant.
Some say that it's influence.
What's that?
Some say that there are some support that you can give them even with unstable seizures. It's
And
also supported this contraindication.
Right, and this is one of those things that it's a little bit of a personal choice. It's also a matter of the doctor writing the prescription. Are they willing to take a chance, or are they more cautious? And then they would say no way. So, I was talking to a neurologist back home, and his feeling is, even without, if the person's seizures, if they haven't had seizures for a year or 2, and they're not taking medication for it, but they need a stimulant for ADHD, I'll see what I can do. I'll work with them, we'll sort of balance out the risks and the rewards. So, same for bipolar disorder. If someone is unmedicated, potentially it can cause a manic episode just like an antidepressant could. If the bipolar is medicated, it's a much safer thing, but even there, maybe, so it depends on the individual.
What do you mean by severe cardiac issues?
So, severe cardiac issues, simply having high blood pressure is not a severe cardiac issue. But if you have significant structural issues, other cardiac issues, then you need to be more cautious in terms of the stimulants. That in terms of blood pressure, and this is especially important for adults, for kids blood pressure is rarely an issue. But for adults, what sometimes happens is an adult has some high blood pressure. It's not sky high, but it's a little bit high, and the doctor says, oh no, we don't want to use a stimulant because of your blood pressure. But often what's found is that the blood pressure goes up a little bit and then it comes down. So it's got to be a big cardiac problem. And then finally, active drug addiction, because if you're abusing other drugs, perhaps you might be more likely to abuse your stimulant. Although if you're smoking a lot of pot, that doesn't mean you're going to abuse your stimulant, because you may not like stimulants as a drug of abuse. But if you're doing cocaine, then the prescriber is going to be very cautious about that. So we also, I don't remember, I might have said this today, the problem with doing 3 presentations in 3 days is it's hard to remember where did I say what day. I think I said this today, that you don't use a response to stimulants as a diagnostic test. So if you take a stimulant and it works well, it doesn't mean you do have ADHD. If you don't, if you take a stimulant and you don't get a good response, it doesn't mean you don't have ADHD. So,
What does it mean if it works well
well,
and you don't have ADHD?
I mean, everybody does better on a stimulant. You know, coffee, I mean, caffeine, you know. Starbucks and Coca-Cola figured this out long ago. So everybody does better to some degree, but it's a matter of how much do they do better.
Is it true that in the States several students use during the
Yeah. The most popular way of abusing ADHD medication is by college students who take it either to stay up all night to study or to stay up all night to party. Because it helps you stay up all night. But and I'm not going to say that that is a good thing, because it's obviously not a good thing. You don't give other people your medication. But the college kids who, if they can't get some Ritalin, what they do is they drink, 3 Red Bulls, or they have Red Bull here, right? Or something else, and they use that instead. So that's really the way that it tends to be abused, more so than people crushing it up and snorting it, like they would cocaine. So that's a whole nother level of abuse if you're getting to that point. Not that I recommend it for obvious reasons.
I just have the impression that amphetamines have a tolerance building mechanism. Does that apply?
In terms of the amphetamines, so Adderall XR, or Vyvanse, they don't have any. Ritalin, Concerta, Adderall XR, or Vyvanse are really pretty equivalent in terms of the effect that they give, the likelihood of abuse, the likelihood of side effects. They're very similar. They're sort of like, the analogy I use is, it's like Coca-Cola and Pepsi. They're very similar, but they're not exactly the same. Some like Coke, and some like Pepsi, and some like them both just as much. So the responses to the different medications can be different. But otherwise, they work the same.
My question was whether about is a tolerance response.
Mm-hmm.
That, in other words, the same, instead of the amphetamine, the same dose, not having the same effect over the long run.
No, once you get to a dose, unless your weight changes a lot over the years, which is really more true for kids than adults, once you get to a dose, that's pretty much your dose. And maybe you need to go up one last, so you find a dose and it works for a few weeks or so, and then it sort of fades a little, you go up a little bit more, and then that's it. So someone could be on the same dose for a year or 5 years or whatever, as long as other things in their life don't change.
Some people that probably they smoke marijuana or whatever to relax, to slow down. On the other hand, they need stimulus. So how do we know if they prefer Coke or marijuana?
Mm-hmm.
We have clients that they use, and maybe
Right.
this is a sign for us.
I think it's hard to read. It's based on the sort of drug of abuse. It's hard to read necessarily what they need from it. But I think often marijuana is used for an anti-anxiety effect. But my hope always is, if someone has ADHD and also something else, my hope always is, if we can address the ADHD first, that we get 2 for 1. They're more on top of their life, they're handling things better, life is easier, they have less reason to be anxious, less reason to be depressed, less reason to drink too much or to smoke pot or whatever. So generally my preference is start with the ADHD, and then you see if you need to address other things. So there's a couple non-stimulant options. So one of them is called Strattera. The stimulants affect dopamine. The non-stimulants primarily affect norepinephrine, but it's one of those things where there's the neurons in norepinephrine feed down to the neurons with dopamine. So by affecting it at the top of the stream, it flows down to the bottom of the stream. That's the theory of why it works. unfortunately, despite the promises when it came out, Strattera is generally not as effective for ADHD or anything. I mean, that's what it's used for, ADHD. I have very few people come to my office or who raise their hand in presentations and say, wow, that Strattera really changed my life, in the way that I hear someone say that about a stimulant. So there are times when if the stimulant doesn't work or they don't want to take it, you can go to Strattera, but it's usually a second choice. You want to start with a stimulant often before you go to Strattera. Third choice, last choice.
One point here.
Yes.
Now we're starting to see Strattera in another way also. When you have people who stimulant cannot go well, but they are really disorganized, many deadlifts, etc., they might have a chance to Strattera again, because they might take the dose, for example, only at night, every night, class all the month, not only one day. Don't forget they are better compliers. And this is the things that we're going to propose in a while for Strattera, with very general, let's say, it will be helpful, right? We have also always the experience for more severe cases now. Before we were stimulants, first choice, and now it's stimulants first choice. Strattera with anxiety, okay, it might be better, not enough. But now, very strong situation, as it is X dependencies, the drug abuse, etc., that they are well now, they might take very much Strattera. That's the politics.
Right. And you're exactly right that there are situations where Strattera really is an option. Certainly someone who has a history of drug abuse where the prescriber is cautious about giving a stimulant, there's nothing at all abusable about Strattera. So the prescriber will not be nervous about that. Maybe that's a place to start, or you can also, they can be used in combination. So if one of the medications is okay but it's not good enough, you can add in the other one. The other thing also that's nice about Strattera is if it does work, it's like the antidepressants. Once it kicks in, it works 24/7. So it works all day, all night, all week. So as opposed to the stimulants that kind of fade out by the end of the day. So for some people, it is the right choice to make. So it's nice, if nothing else, it's nice to have another possibility there. Now the last possibility is the antidepressant Wellbutrin that has some effect on ADHD, but is by far your last choice. So again, it's another possibility, but you don't want to start at the last choice, you start at the first choice. Then I have here something called Intuitive. It's again a non-stimulant, although as far as I know, the manufacturer is also the same manufacturer the other ones that are not available here in Greece. So, but don't worry, you're not missing a whole lot as far as Intuitive goes. So.
Do these have the same side effects as stimulants?
The side effects for the non-stimulants are a little bit different because they're affecting different parts of the brain and different neurotransmitters. The side effects are a little bit different.
Can you give an example of side effects?
The side effects are things like dry mouth, some weight gain, some sedation, things of that sort. Right, gastrointestinal effects and sexual side effects, like some of the antidepressants do.
Meaning you want it less, not more.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Maybe you mentioned something on this already. As far as adolescents are concerned, how much percentage would you say that ameliorate could be better without complications?
It's a hard question to answer because partially it depends. When we say do better, what do we mean? Right. It's hard to say. It depends. What are this person's strengths and abilities? What are the demands put on them? What are the structures and supports put on them? So, how much are you willing to work? You as the parent willing to work with that adolescent? How much are the teachers willing to work with that adolescent?
Let's say that is very willing.
Right. Yeah.
Let's assume.
Right.
Ideally.
It's hard to say. I mean, I think that certainly an involved parent, an involved school, a student who, because of whatever temperament in whatever way they've been raised, has a good personality and a good work ethic, and it's important that they do well, obviously that person will do better in life.
But I mean, even without medication.
Well, with medication or without medication. The question, though, is all of that going to be enough without the medication? And that's more a choice that's made case by case.
So would you say that most kids with ADD usually end up taking medication, or that the vast majority is?
Often they do, but not all of them.
But it's not like a 20% that takes medication. It's a bigger number.
It's probably a bigger number, yeah. So, in terms of alternative treatments, there's one treatment called CogMed Working Memory Training. So the company name is CogMed, and then it's Working Memory Training. Just really quick, as far as my reading of the research, and every year at the big ADHD conference, I go to the session that talks about, what's the state of the research on alternative treatments, because I always get the question, I want to know what else is out there that could be helpful. This is the only thing that has any good research that shows that it's effective. And what they found is that the way it's done is computer exercises, or you do these exercises on your computer at home, 5 days a week for 5 weeks for half an hour. 80% of the people who finish the training show functional improvements in daily life. So not simply that doing this makes you better at this, because I could give you tic-tac-toe to do for a month, tic-tac-toe, X's and O's, and you'll be better at tic-tac-toe, but who cares? Because that doesn't make you better at anything else. What the CogMed folks have shown is doing better here makes you better here in the rest of your life. So it goes from here and it transfers out into other parts of your life. So that's an interesting intervention. I'm a CogMed provider. I do that at home. The only reason I put my name to anything is because I think it's valid. So I'm very slow to put my name on things. But CogMed, they convinced me. So there's one CogMed provider here in Athens, but if you're interested in learning more, you can go to the website, which is cogmed.com. You can see the research, you can read the articles, they have webinars, they have other information. So if you're interested in becoming a CogMed provider, you can do that as well. They're not paying me for this or anything, but yeah.
And you do it once in your lifetime.
So you do it for the 5 weeks, and then it appears that that's it. And they've shown so far that a year out that the benefits remain. The question is how much further it goes out. I'm sure that research is in process, but we don't have it yet. But that's one of my things I would love to see 2 years out, 3 years out, 5 years out.
My son had 1 month, 1.5 months of those sessions here in Athens when he was 12 years old. But nothing, we didn't find out any difference in ADHD. And I think that the environment when they do this is very protected. They don't have any other things that they can see and they can listen. So how does this treatment goes out of the everyday life?
So what it does is you do the exercise on the computer, it improves your working memory. What people find is that by doing it, that the exercises here, even though they're somewhat simple in a way, I mean they're hard, but they're simple. They're not complicated, but they're difficult. That enables them to have a stronger working memory out in the rest of their life. So when they do have other things going on, they're having an easier time keeping their attention where it's supposed to be. So I don't know exactly what happened with your son when he did it, and it could just be that he's one of that 20%, 80% gets some benefit. For whatever reason, he might be part of the 20%. That's something that I'm sure there's research being done. Also trying to separate out who's going to be in the 80, who's going to be in the 20, so they can be more targeted about the people that they say, yes, I think this will probably work for you, or I don't think this is going to be helpful for you. So, But, you know, this is where the research is important to be able to show that something does transfer out, and for a significant percentage of the people who do it. And that without research, it's possible that something would be helpful. It might be. But if we don't have good research with good control groups and things like that, I don't know if it's going to be helpful, you know? So it's hard to predict if it would be. And my feeling is if I'm going to spend time and money and get my hopes up for something, I want to know that I want a good chance that it's going to work, rather than just crossing my fingers and hoping.
I know that the topic on nutrition is very contradictory. I have read a lot about it because one of my 3 children has ADHD. And when I first found out, I wanted to find alternative ways to handle this, including therapy and training, education, and all that. And I did apply a lot of what I read. One of the most, something that kept popping up was the fact around milk, and that milk, animal milk, is not good for anybody after they pass the stage of being a baby. And that we're the only species that continue to drink animal milk after that afterwards, and they suggest soya and what have you. I know that's very contradictory. I want your opinion on that. It worked with my child a lot. I don't know if it's that works or everything together, of course.
Right.
That I can't know, but I would like your opinion on that.
And that, which brings us to the next slide. So, I mean, definitely there's a lot of talk, and there's been for a long time, about the effects of diet on ADHD. And thus far, what the research has what good research has consistently found is that there's no connection between diet and ADHD. You know, you found that if you removed milk from your son's diet, some of this stuff got better. It's possible that he has, you know, a specific sensitivity or allergy to milk, but that's not ADHD. But if he does better without milk, then obviously you take him off of milk, you know. So, so diet is not a good intervention for ADHD. But having said that, I'm a big proponent of eating healthy foods, trying to eat more organic, less stuff, less processed that's full of extra chemicals and salt, and you know. So I'm all about healthy eating. But just because everybody does better, I'm also all about getting enough sleep and exercising and relaxing, and I mean, because that's just good for everybody too.
But with an ADHD child, exercising is even better than somebody without. So, of course, it's good for everybody, but if you reduce sugar, for example, and you increase exercise, an ADHD child has a chance to vent a lot more than somebody who doesn't.
And someone who tends to be hyperactive and has been sitting in school for 7 hours or sitting at a desk for 8 hours at work, yeah, absolutely, exercise is important, moving around. So, you know, definitely that's all good stuff. There's some research coming out, beginning to kind of come out about the benefits of mindfulness training, so meditation for ADHD. That's going to be good for you anyway, even if you don't have ADHD, so I could hardly, you know, recommend against it. Neurofeedback, the research is still a little bit mixed. Some studies say it works, some studies say it doesn't. We don't know for sure. So that's one of those, you know, let's talk in a couple of years and see what new studies have come out. Russ Ramsey is a psychologist.
Mindfulness that you have reported here, you have an opinion on mindfulness training.
I think that the mindfulness can be helpful. Well, for emotion regulation and for attention regulation. So mindfulness meaning meditation and things of that sort. It needs to be adapted a little bit for ADHD. But there is some research beginning to come out that it seems like it has some benefit. The question is it benefiting ADHD specifically, or is it simply that everybody in a calm state of mind has better focus, and when we're anxious and when we're preoccupied, our focus is worse? That still needs to be separated out, but if it helps, then it helps. So,
what about acupuncture, and especially auricular acupuncture that tries to address specific parts of the brain that involved with ADHD?
At this moment, there is not enough good research that shows that acupuncture is helpful for ADHD. It's possible, what? It's possible that it is, but the research, we don't have research that says that it is. So at this moment, I can't recommend it. If it works for you or for someone, if it works, then you do it. But generally my preference is you start with the things that are shown by research to be likely to work, and then you work your way down. And if you get to the bottom, then you try those things as well. But you don't start at the bottom and work your way up. Kind of the analogy I have is, if you can't find your keys, you don't start by looking in the attic. You start by looking in the kitchen and in the living room. And then if you wind up in the attic, and you go, oh yeah, I was looking through boxes, that's where they are. But you start at the most likely place and then you work your way down the list. If you're interested in a review of the research on these all of these alternative treatments, including therapy and coaching, this is a really good book, Non-Medication Treatments for Adult ADHD.
Fish oil, specifically, because that was big important.
Right.
Benefit to kids.
So the question is about fish oils or omega-3 fatty acids. The research on that is a little bit mixed as well, but it seems like maybe there's some small benefit from it.
Mostly at hair and nails.
What's that?
Mostly at the hair and nails.
Right. Well, and that's the other thing about it is, omega-3s are good for you in other ways also, including cardiovascular, but it's one of those things that I'm stealing this from someone else, but it's cheap, it's safe, and it's easy. So you buy a bottle of pills, it'll last you 3 months, probably for what, like €8 or something. No real side effects, fine, take it, You don't leave it at that and say, okay, I take my fish oil pill and that's a solution to everything. But it's an easy thing to do. So I take one and I take a multivitamin. Yeah, there's no real harm in it. For, $10 I can be a sport. So, yeah.
When we do complement or any other exercises for memory, to increase memory, do we actually create new connections in the brain, new synapses? That's what we do.
Right, and that is one of the things. The CogMed folks have evaluated the benefits of it in multiple ways. And one of the things that they've done is they've done PET scans and shown increased activity in the parts of the brain that are known from just basic research to be involved in working memory. So after you do the CogMed, there's more activity in that part of the brain, which makes sense that if you're performing better in life but you don't show it on a brain scan, that's an interesting question then to answer how that could be, which would suggest more of a placebo effect. But that was one of the lines of research that they did, that they in fact showed through brain scan studies that there is more activity in that part of the brain.
And this can be applied also to people with Alzheimer or other diseases who have memory problems.
Right. I don't know about Alzheimer's specifically because there's a lot of other things going on there, but certainly normally aging adults, so folks in their 60s and 70s whose working memory is sliding a little bit, folks who've had a brain injury of some sort, folks who've gone through chemotherapy for cancer, which tends to have a negative effect on working memory. So yeah, it's being looked at multiple populations, but ADHD is the big obvious population for CogMed. So that's where they started, but I don't think that's where they're going to end in terms of the other groups that they look at. So let's talk a little bit here about coaching. I have a saying that you can't leave the past in the past if it's still happening in the present. So no amount of therapy to help our clients feel better about themselves is going to be enough if they're still having exactly the same troubles before they started coming in. So it's a matter of helping them be more effective. This is the change what you can part of the equation. So one of the benefits of coaching is being successful now makes it easier to leave those old failures and old struggles in the past. To be able to say, you know what, that was my life, but that's not my life anymore. Life is getting better going forward. So helping someone be more consistent and manage their stuff better and meet their obligations, it helps with a lot of stuff in terms of how they see themselves. It provides a better foundation for the therapy work that we do. So there's a lot to be said for coaching. I think it's also worth pointing out that when we say coaching, it's not like it's one thing. Just like therapy is not one thing. Everyone does their own brand of therapy or coaching. So when I use the word coaching, what I'm talking about is specific practical strategies. So the problem is your room is disorganized. Here are some solutions. Let's try this. Or you have trouble setting priorities. You have trouble staying to priorities. Here are some strategies. So that's what, when I say coaching, that's what I'm talking about. Part of, we had kind of talked about earlier, part of the trouble with having weaker executive functions is it creates more chaos, which creates more work for your executive function. Because they're not working as well, there's more to keep track of, and things get lost and disorganized, and you run late, and all that stuff that comes out. So part of what we're doing when we're coaching with clients is helping our clients lead a more proactive lifestyle. So in other words, managing stuff ahead of time, not just reacting and managing things after the fact. Because it's often much harder to manage things after the fact than it is to manage it beforehand. Part of this also involves, and this is definitely easier said than done, but all that kind of boring stuff like getting enough sleep, eating healthy food, exercising regularly, feeling like you've earned relaxation. In other words, I did everything I need to, I can now kick back and relax. And that stuff's easier said than done because in order to be able to do all of that stuff, you have to be managing things well. If you don't manage it well, that stuff does worse, and then you pay the price for not managing it well. So we're helping not just with this sort of most immediate thing, but also some of these foundational things like sleep and exercise and diet, because that's important as well. So basically our goal here is not simply to focus on willpower, which the problem with focusing on willpower is you can only go so far with it. It'll only take you so far to say, just try to do better. Because other people have told them, just try to do better. And frankly, with any of us, we're already trying to do well. So it's probably not, that's probably not the missing thing. So it's more a matter of reducing some of the chaos in their life so they're more likely to make those right choices at the right moments. For myself, the therapy work that I do is really a mix of therapy and coaching. So I talk about old stuff, as in, what was it like when you were growing up, and kind of maybe more dynamic issues. And I talk about very practical, what's coming up this week? Let's talk, you have a report due for work. What's your plan for doing it? When can you do it? Oh, you're going to do it Tuesday? All right, what else do you have going on Tuesday? Do you have a specific time to do it on Tuesday, or just at some point on Tuesday it's going to get done? What other meetings do you need to, do you have any other meetings on Tuesday? So we're really getting down to specific kinds of things. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that most schools of therapy will tolerate mixing some of the coaching in. Some of them won't. So the more traditionally psychoanalytic, where it's more about transference and countertransference, probably the coaching is not going to mix well. So in those cases, there are other people in this world who are ADHD coaches where you can refer that out to them and you just focus on the therapy part. And I have clients that I do therapy with, and then they're seeing somebody else for coaching. So there's really, you can kind of mix and match depending on what you want to do. The one thing to consider, though, in terms of coaching is that anybody can call themselves a coach. For example, not anyone can call themselves a psychologist. In order to say, I'm a psychologist, you have to have certain things that you've done. Coach is not a protected term, so anyone can say they're a coach. So it means that there are a lot of people who are coming into the field of coaching because they like the idea of being helpful to people. And I'm fine with that. But you know, this is the joke that I have is there are people out there where, you know, it's kind of like, oh, I read half of Driven to Distraction. Now I'm a coach. You know, so just wanting to be helpful is not enough. Having ADHD yourself is not enough. Having a kid with ADHD is not enough. That there are training programs out there, but it's like anything else. You need to be serious about what you do. You need to be good at what you do. So for us as psychologists, I think it's a matter of finding those people in the community who have taken their coach training seriously and really have something to offer beyond just the obvious basics. The question often comes up, is this ADHD or is it personality? Is it ADHD or is it a matter of motivation or desire or anxiety or depression or whatever? And generally my preference is you start by addressing neurology first, or at least I assume that it's about neurology. So if someone's having trouble, you know, if they're showing up to appointments late, I'll assume it's about neurology, that it's the forgetfulness or the time management problem. And I'll try to address it either through medication, through cognitive, or using coping or coaching strategies. So we talk about how do you keep track of your appointments? When, you know, you set it into your phone, when the alarm rings, do you actually get up and go? Or do you say, well, I'll just do one more thing and then I go? And then, you know, you run late or you misjudged. Actually, it takes not 20 minutes to get to my office, it takes 40 minutes, at least at 5 o'clock. At 2 o'clock, it takes 20 minutes. At 5 o'clock, it takes 40 minutes. So, so addressing more from that end, then get into the psychology side of it. So for example, if the problem is someone, you know, they were 5 o'clock appointment, they knew they were supposed to leave at 5:20, the alarm went off at 5:15, they started wrapping things up and someone comes into their office. Ugh. So then on the psychology side, I work with them on how do you say no, how do you set limits, how do you say, you know what, this is really important, I got a thing, I got to run, can we talk about this tomorrow? So maybe some assertiveness or other sort of whatever other psychology is involved in that kind of situation. But I'll often start with the neurology before I assume something is psychology. Does that kind of make sense? I think it's important in our work with clients to tell them right up front, you know, let's talk about what's going on, let's come up with some strategies, okay, blah, 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 we have some strategies, and then you say, it's important to emphasize, you know, these may or may not work. We're going to figure it out, but here's the thing, if it works, that's great, and that tells us some things. But if it doesn't work, that's okay too, because that tells us things also. So if it doesn't work, let's take a look and try to figure out why it's not working, because that is what will teach us how to come up with the next better strategy. And sometimes we've got to try a few until we hit the bullseye with something. So what it does is it gives our clients more of a willingness to take that chance, because the fear is that you give them some homework, some things to try, they do it, it doesn't work, or they just forget to do it, and then 6.5 days go by and they go, oh, I'm going back to the psychologist. And then here it is again, I didn't do my homework, she's going to yell at me, it's high school all over again. And then they don't show up. And then they're gone. That's the last thing you want. So it's a matter of telling them right up front, there's no magic, there's no instant solutions, we're going to try it, we'll figure it out. And to really give that sense of acceptance and that sense of positive regard in what you do. Because it takes a certain amount of, you know, it takes a certain amount of risk for them to get their hopes up again. They've gotten their hopes up in the past and it didn't work out. Now they're getting their hopes up again. I'm hoping you have something to show me, something to offer me that nobody else did before. And if the first time they try something and it doesn't work, they may then just crash from it. So a lot of coaching is not just strategies, but it's about using the right tools for the job. Unfortunately, there are certain clients who, because they're very self-conscious about how they do things and when they do things, they can be self-conscious about using tools. And by tools, a tool could be something simple as writing a note on a scrap of paper. That's a tool right there. that scrap of paper is a tool. So they may be self-conscious about putting things into a schedule, or if they're walking down the hallway at work and someone says, "Oh, can you do me a favor? I need you to get me that whatever. Can you bring that over to me later?" "Oh, okay." And they keep it in their mind. They're hesitant to write it down or to say, "You know what? Do me a favor. I'm running off to a meeting. Can you send me an email? Like when you get back to your desk, send me an email and remind me about doing that." Or, "That's fine. You know what? If I don't get it to you by the end of the day, just call me up and remind me. I just got caught up in other things." Easy, and people tend to accept it. But for a lot of our clients, they're self-conscious about drawing any attention to themselves. So to say, "Okay, I'll get you that. Hold on one sec. Let me write that down." And they're concerned if they write it down, people are going to think they're stupid or something. So part of it is normalizing that and making it okay. It's okay to write it down. And by the way, if your choices are being known as that guy who writes a lot of stuff down, or being known as that goddamn guy who always forgets things, what's the better reputation to have? So, especially when the third option of that guy who doesn't write things down, but boy, is he really good at remembering things. If that third option is not available, then you got to pick one of the two that is available. It is much better to be the guy who writes things down.
What happens if you forget to write down?
Right. So the question is, what happens if you forget to write it down? And that's going to happen, because nobody's going to be perfect. But if you can get into the habit of writing things down, it makes it easier to write it down. If you get into the habit of always having a pen and a piece of paper in your pocket, it's easier to write it down as opposed to, "Oh, I should write that down. Oh man, there's nothing." Okay. All right, I'm just going to try to remember that one then. So, being in the habit of having stuff there, or sending yourself a text message. Remember to bring this. Boom, you send it, and now you get a text message that's unopened. Or sending yourself an email, so when you get back to the desk, it's there. And maybe it doesn't work every single time, but if at least it helps sometimes, maybe half the time you actually write it down and then you actually find the thing that you wrote down. If it only helps half the time, that's still half better than it was before. And maybe half better puts you in that normal range of forgetting, where you can say, "Oh, God, yeah, man, I got so busy I completely forgot. Okay, yeah, I'll get you that now." But because you remember the last couple things, maybe they're okay with that. So, one of the tools that's often used is planners, because for most people, for most adults, it's important to have a planner. It's important to have a schedule of some sort where you keep track of the things that you need to keep track of. For some reason, my printer has decided not to work. So, for some people, the right tool for the job is to do it electronically, meaning on their phone or on their computer. And what's nice about that is your phone, if you keep it on your phone, it's always with you. For the most part, you always have your phone with you. Whereas if you have a big schedule book like I use, I don't always have that with me. If I'm at home, I always have it with me. If I'm at work, I always have it with me. If someone calls me on my cell phone when I'm out shopping or something, I don't have it with me. But your phone is always with you, so it's easy to put stuff into it. It's also, what's also kind of a nice thing is, on your phone, if you lose your phone, there are ways to set it so the data backs up somewhere. So even if the phone explodes, you don't lose all your appointments. If I lose my paper schedule book, it's gone. And I have people scheduled a month from now, and I have no idea who they are. I mean, I sort of do, but I don't know when. So it would be a disaster. So I actually, if you open up my schedule book, the front cover, in the corner in big letters, and I got this idea from a psychiatrist I know, it says $250 reward if found inside my schedule book. And I would gladly pay twice that amount to get my schedule book back. So What's nice also about using either software on the computer or using a smartphone is that you can set alarms. My book will not beep at me. A phone will. So you can set it not to go off at the time of the thing, but to go off ahead of time. And whether that means 5 minutes before, or a day before, or a week before, you can set those reminder alarms. So that basically your phone becomes your perspective memory in this case. So that's a really nice way to do it. Now the downside is smartphones can be used to waste a lot of time. You know, so you get your Facebook alerts and your Twitter feeds, and oh, I'm just going to check the sports score and all that other stuff. So it really does go both ways, but if you can limit what you do with it, you set it up in certain ways, you can make it more likely that it gets used for the things that you should be using it for, or at least the more productive things. On the other side, you know, a paper planner is often helpful because it's simpler to use. And people who are not big on technology, a planner is very, or a paper book is very quick and easy. You write something in and you erase it off, done. Which planner is better depends on what your circumstances are. So people who don't have a lot of stuff going on, often an electronic schedule is better. Because if you have a paper schedule, even if it's a small one you keep in your pocket, if you open it up, nope, nothing today, and you open up tomorrow, nope, nothing today, and there's something 3 days from now, by the time 3 days rolls around, it's like, well, I don't know, I probably don't have anything. But they don't check it to see that they don't have anything, and maybe they do have something. Whereas if you put it into something electronic and it beeps at you, you know, you can check it easily, but then it'll beep at you and remind you when the time comes. So people with less to do, often electronic is better. People who have more going on, often paper is better. So it's finding the right tool for the job. In addition to a smartphone that can, you know, you can set these alarms and stuff like that, there's also other things like, there's something called Watchminder, which is a watch that you wear that you can set multiple alarms, including vibes, like so it vibrates instead of beeping so you don't bother people around you. There's something, or Vibralight is another option. There's something called Invisible Clock, which is like a little pager that you wear on your belt or in your pocket. So there are some other options out there that are a little bit more kind of higher tech. But otherwise, just plain old kitchen timers, like the ones that you set, you know, 20 minutes, check the pasta, that work very well. And what's nice about these is they're quick and they're cheap, so you can buy like 6 of them. Put one in the kitchen, one in the bathroom, one next to the computer, one next to the TV. You can put a few of them around so that you have the right thing when you need it.
Can I make a question?
Yeah.
Those first tools, how can you set alarms? With which you set in 2 hours, in 3 hours? What's the point? How you can use one of those tools, the first ones?
So what you do is you set the alarm either, they offer a bunch of different alarms. One of them is a countdown alarm, so you say, okay, 1 hour, let's say. I'm working on this for 1 hour, and then I'm going to go do something else. Or you could set an alarm that is for a specific time. So, you know, Thursday at 2 o'clock, this is going to go off. But the idea is that it notifies you that a particular time has come. So, in terms of managing blocks of time.
Sandwich is very, with sand.
Yeah, like an egg timer, that is sand that counts down. There's also another thing called, what's it called? It's like a red disc, and you turn it, and then it, what's it called? I'll remember it. We'll keep talking, I'll remember it, and then I'll tell you about it. So, because life is all about time these days, these sorts of things that manage time for us can be a helpful kind of way to let you know that a certain time has arrived. In terms of all the strategies that are out there, like if you start looking around, especially on the internet, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of ADHD-friendly strategies about everything that you can think of, from organizing your socks to, I don't know, picking a career or something. So, on the one hand, that's great. There's all this information out there. The problem is that if you don't have a good understanding of ADHD and how it operates and how it affects people and what are the demands in the environment, it's hard to pick the strategies that are really going to be most effective for someone. So that's why it's important to have that understanding. And I think that the clinicians who have that deeper understanding are going to be more effective for their clients, and as opposed to the clinicians who don't have a deeper understanding, or maybe some of the coaches who jump in without some good awareness of interpersonal dynamics and individual dynamics, are probably less likely to be as effective as we might hope them to be. So, the simplest interventions here are things like having lists of strategies, where you just have lists and lists of strategies, and you say, here's something that you can do, and here's a strategy, and here's a strategy, and you just kind of start throwing strategies at a client, and you hope one of them sticks. The more kind of sophisticated, deeper understanding are the strategies that are based on the executive functions. We're going to talk about some specific strategies based on the specific executive functions. Somewhere in the middle is this thing that I call fundamental strategies. I'm actually going to kind of skip through them pretty quickly, just in the interest of time, because we started late. I don't want to run late. I don't want people to feel like they have to stick around and then we don't cover the therapy part. So I'll kind of zip through those a little bit. And they're a little bit more abstract in some ways. But so the coaching with fundamental strategies, so some basic ideas here. And some of this is a little bit of repetition about or repetitive of some of the stuff we're talking about with executive functions and response inhibition. But what the slides are, or I'll cover the 3 slides in this section that are the most important, and then there's some slides, which I'll show you next, that have specific strategies that you guys can use. So the basic idea of inattention here is that inattention is basically putting your attention on the wrong thing at the wrong time. But most simply, that's kind of what happens. So the fundamental strategies, as I call them, there's 2 fundamental strategies. So the goal here is to reduce the chances of attending to the wrong stimuli by reducing distractions. So make the important things stand out more by bringing down the distractions. That's one way. The flip side is increase the chances of attending to the right stimuli at the right times by amplifying important stimuli. So maybe you can't change the distractions, but you increase the strength of the important stimuli. So we can really work it on both sides of this. Does that make sense? So in the next slides, and again, this is in your handout, so you can kind of mark them and take a look afterwards. Here's some specific strategies like turning off the TV when you're talking reduces distractions, or using reminder notes, keeping a written schedule, using alarms. These are strategies you can use that amplify or increase the importance of, or to increase the likelihood of paying attention to the important stimuli. For hyperactivity, the first fundamental strategy is seek out situations that allow the safe expression of hyperactivity. So exercise, obviously, or finding a job that allows you to move around, as opposed to getting a job that you have to sit for 8 or 9 hours a day. The flip side of that is minimize situations that require more restraint than you can muster. So we had talked about watching movies at home rather than at the movie theater as one example of that. If you don't have to sit, if you can avoid a situation where you have to sit still, then avoid it. Don't make your life harder than it needs to be. And then, underneath this, I say work on tolerance for repetitive or mundane activities. To the extent that you can, it's not a bad idea. I don't hold a lot of hope on that, but to the extent that you can, try to work on that patience. But really a better alternative is to build in some rewards. We're all better able to kind of push through something boring if we can create a reward for ourselves on the other side. And the reward doesn't need to be something big like a new car. It could be something small like, you know, I'm going to allow myself to check my email after I finish this article or something like that. Then finally, for the impulsivity, the fundamental strategies for impulsivity, the first is create barriers to problematic actions by reducing tempting stimuli. This, or as I call it, lead me not unto temptation. So kind of the simple example here is, if you're on a diet and you're trying to eat healthier food, don't bring junk food into the house. Because if it's in the fridge and you're staring at it, it is much more likely you're going to eat it. If you're at home and it's at the supermarket, it's much less likely you're going to eat the junk that you don't want yourself to eat. Flip side here is set up cushions to reduce the damage done from impulsive acts. So if you have to buy the junky food, buy the small pack of it and not the big pack. So if you eat it, you can only eat a little bit and not eat a whole lot of it. So those are the fundamental strategies. But like I said, we're going to kind of skip ahead a little bit. Although, well, let me do a little bit more, and then we'll finish up coaching, and then we'll take a quick break, and then we'll do therapy. So we talked about each of the executive functions. We talked about how those executive functions play out in somebody's life if they have ADHD. Now we're going to take the third step of, based on those, what are the strategies that are likely to be helpful? So if you have problems with working memory, what are strategies that are going to be helpful for working memory? What I discovered when I was writing my workbook was that really you could boil down all of these different strategies that are out there for working memory or sense of time or hindsight and forethought. You can boil them all down to basically 3 basic ideas, or what I call key concepts. So all of these other strategies, they pretty much fall underneath one of these key concepts. What's nice about it is it's much easier to remember 3 key concepts than it is to remember 300 strategies. So that's part of it, is it's easier than if you can remember the key concept, you can create your new strategies specific to your situation. But also, as you're reading, some article on ADHD on the internet and it's throwing all these strategies out, you can look at the strategies and instead of being overwhelmed and saying, oh my God, I can never apply all of this into my life, you can look at them and say, oh, okay, yeah, this, really this is just one of, that new thing, that really just falls under this, and this new thing, that falls under that, and this is one of those. So it gives you a framework to then understand what you're looking at. So,
This is like mind mapping.
is it like mind mapping? I don't know, is it? I don't have a clear sense exactly of what mind mapping is. I'll say it and then you tell me if it is. So, the 3 key concepts here. The first is make important tasks and items stand out more to make it more likely that your attention will stay focused on them. So, what are a couple examples of some things that you might already be doing or that you've suggested to clients, that you've read in a book, whatever? What are some examples of something that fits, some strategies that fit under this key concept? Maybe I should ask this after the break. So, what are things you're already, we all do this already. What are some things?
Like when you say, like in the table in the front of the door, take out all the other stuff and just keep the important stuff that you have to take with you.
Right here in your hand.
Write it on your hand, like you did. Yes. Because you can lose a piece of paper, you're not going to lose your hand.
Just wash your hand.
Yeah. And that's a great strategy. It's right there. And it's here where you see it. It's not here. Because you'll never see here, So, absolutely. You look and you see and you go, oh yeah, that. So, reminder, reminder, reminder.
Stickers in the door.
Yeah, putting a Post-it on the door. not at your desk maybe, at the door. At the door you go out, or next to the door handle, or something like that. Alternatively, the second strategy here, and this is something the opposite of the first one, is the fewer distractions, the easier it is to stay focused on and remember what you should. So, you know, I was driving with a friend of mine, and he had his cell phone. He was playing music from his cell phone through the car stereo. So that's pretty cool that he could do that. But like every 2 minutes, it would give this little beep. It's like, what the hell? What is that? And so I asked him eventually, after like 20 of these. And what it was is, there's a baseball team in Philadelphia called the Phillies. And every time somebody posted something on like a Phillies bulletin board, he got a reminder, a notice on his phone. It's like, are you serious? Like, is that really so important that you need to know right away that somebody posted something? So like, that's an example of not reducing distraction. That's an example of increasing distractions. It should also be noted that he confessed to me that he probably has, or he has ADHD. He was diagnosed as a kid, doesn't take medication, but I guess it's working out well enough for him. He's still got a job and his wife loves him, so things are okay. And he's a great guy, so, you know, whatever. But like, that's a great example of not reducing distractions.
I have noticed with both adults and children that have ADHD, that they have a difficulty enjoying what they're doing or what they're having right now. So if I buy a brand new car and it's a lifetime dream, I'm really happy about it, but you know what? I'm thinking of the next car I'm going to buy in a year. And I'm already living that moment, so this moment is already worthless. And I can see that in my 10-year-old son too. He's enjoying swimming now, but he's thinking more of what we're going to do in the afternoon that I promised him about.
Right. And that can happen, or it's that whatever it is exciting until it's not exciting. And that, you know, new hobby that was the thing. And then, right, and then they do it, and it's like, okay, well, I know how this
bored of
works.
it easily, basically.
Yeah.
You get bored of it easily.
Yeah, because the mystery is gone, and the shine has come off, the new car doesn't have that smell anymore, and then you say, ooh, look at that car that just went by. So
does that happen, sorry to interrupt, does that happen since 9